Hello everyone, we'll be talking about differentiated instruction today. I'd like to start by just talking about the definition of differentiated instruction. By definition, it is factoring students' individual learning styles and levels of readiness first before designing a plan. I think one of the most important things I've taken from the reading and from the lectures in class is that differentiated instruction is meeting a student where they are. We have to understand the skill set they have already acquired over time and meet them at that skill set and learn how to differentiate our instruction to meet that student's needs the best that we can. I also have on this slide a pretty large definition that comes from Wikipedia, and it really just talks about the different ways that we should differentiate our instruction in terms of acquiring content, processing, contrasting, or making sense of ideas. And in this way, we can effectively see if our differentiation is helping our students. I've also put in this picture here as a little bit of a kind of a funny, just because our whole life we've been told that because we do things differently doesn't mean it's not right, and this is a lot of what differentiated instruction is about. So this picture just kind of sets on that aspect in terms of the fact that it talks about the all of these animals trying to climb a tree. Just because some can and some can't doesn't mean that it's not right, and doesn't mean that they're not capable of doing amazing things. So how teachers can differentiate is another thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about the 4 ways of differentiated instruction. They can be content, which is the Bloom's taxonomy, which is applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating, and understanding our students. Next is process, and that is in terms of style or the way that we like to learn. We call those learning styles, and that is by visual, which is by watching videos, auditory, which is by listening to either a lecture or listening to a podcast or something of that nature, or kinesthetic, which is using our hands, getting up and moving, and using the actions that we take with our body to engulf all of the information that are being taught. And then last, it's through words, so that might be through reading, or also might be part of that auditory as well. So along with that, we have the support as a part of the process, which is learning the way students like to interact with peers, or learning the way students like to interact with their professors or teachers. It's very important that we learn this, because some students do well individually, some students do well in a group setting, some do well with a partner, or some do well just with a teacher one-on-one. And it's important to learn those things about a student, because they will not be effective learners and be able to help their group if they're in a group assignment if they aren't well cut for group assignments. The next part of the differentiation instruction is product, and that's how we test the mastery of the students. Through that, we'll be able to test the skills that we've taught to the students from the get-go, and that could be through quizzes or projects or activities, and just making them recite the information that they've learned. And from that, you can see if the teaching style that you have implemented is effective for that learner. Lastly, for the 4 ways of differentiation, it could be the learning environment. This could be in terms of the physical or psychological elements of the classroom. Really, that's more in terms of how the classroom feels, how the classroom looks, and the way the students take the classroom in as they enter every single morning. So that could be anywhere from the way the furniture in the room is arranged, or the different types of furniture. Something that we've talked about in recent years is the flexible seating. I had that implemented in a internship classroom for me, and I think it was very helpful, and it does help those students who have a fidget or need something to do to keep them busy while still being able to learn. So I think that flexible seating can be very effective for students. And then lastly, with the learning environment, we'll talk a little bit about the classroom management techniques, which is just in terms of how you choose to deal with every single situation that happens in your classroom, and if you choose to take that in a very disciplinary action, or maybe just meeting a student exactly where they are, which is the point of differentiation instruction. Some examples of activities are maybe for like a reading assignment, creating a PowerPoint that can summarize that information for your learners so that they're actually taking something away from that reading. Some may actually just like to traditionally read the article or passage, and that's how they'll take in that instruction. Some might be able to identify the author's position and provide evidence that support their view. That's very important because then a student is not only able to comprehend what has happened in the text, but understand why the author wrote it that way. Another thing is to, in the story, be able to differentiate the fact from opinion. That's a very important aspect of about 4th and 5th grade. And from there, they're able to determine what is a good or a bad source when it comes to finding something online, or to if the things that they find in passages are factual or not. So that's just a few examples of activities. Next, we'll talk about preparing the students for the classroom and for differentiated instructions. We're preparing the students and classroom for differentiated instruction. Sorry, my mistake. So first of all, for students, we're going to have to let them know what is happening, because some students are very used to the traditional, like, you come into the classroom, you learn, this is how you do things. So once you start to implement differentiation instruction into the classroom, you need to be honest with students about what the expectations are, because in order to have this be effective, you need to have a trust relationship with your students that show that this instruction is going to be helpful, not only for them, but also for you as an instructor. So something that's very important is letting students know that they can move at their own pace. This is very important because some students are going to want to move like a unit a week. Some students are going to want to move a unit a day, and that is okay, as long as you can keep everybody riled and keep all of your documents straight, because some of those students are going to want to move very far ahead, and some of them are going to want to move slow. I know me personally, I like to read for comprehension, so that means that I like to take things slowly and understand the things that I'm reading as I'm reading them, instead of skimming through them and trying to decipher what it means later on. Another thing that's really important is that we need to teach our students to be independent learners. While they may want to rely on a student or a group or a partner, we also need to let them know that there is a lot they can do on their own. Considering the way technology has moved and the implementations we've put in their classrooms already, students are able to learn a lot just from studying with themselves. It is important to be that support for the student, but it's also important for them to take charge of their own learning. I think it's also important to let students know that they'll be having checks throughout the semester, throughout the month, whatever it is, just to test their knowledge on the subject, so that we make sure that that differentiated instruction is actually effective for that student. And that can also be pretty good data for this for the teacher to pass along, not only to the principal, but to the teacher of the student for next year, or to any kind of data that teacher wants to collect for a differentiated instruction. I think it's also important, this should have been mentioned before, but you need to give your students a pre-assessment. That way you can assess what type of differentiation needs to go into place. Some of those questions may include, like, how do you like to learn? What environment do you like to be in? Would you like it quiet? Would you like it loud? Who do you like to work with? Things of that nature. I think it's important to do that pre-assessment, because not only are students able to be honest about their feelings from the get-go, but they're also able to just take charge of their own learning. They're able to be honest about how they feel, how they learn, and that is how they're going to learn the best. I think it's also important to be honest with the students about the involvement of their parents from the get-go. The parents need to be involved in their learning process. To some extent, they kind of need to be on their own, but along with that, you need to let parents know what their learning styles look like, just so that when they're at home, they're able to implement that at their house as well, and hopefully help them. If not, they can ask you any questions, and hopefully you're well versed on the type of learner their student is, so you can help them in the best way possible. And I also think a important quote I put in here was, "Seek to understand before being understood." That quote, it goes without saying, is just so effective in every single environment, but it's specifically effective in this differentiation of instruction environment, because we need to understand these students before they can understand what we want from them. In terms of preparing the classroom for this differentiated instruction, we need to have 5 keys of good arrangement, starting with making sure that the room is consistent with the goals of the instructor. And the objectives and activities. If you don't have things in order and if you don't have things structured and organized, it's going to be very hard to implement this into your classroom. One very important thing that I think is very necessary for every single classroom, regardless of if they have differentiated instruction, is making sure that the busier areas in the classroom are free of congestion. So if you have an area that you know students like to go around, you need to make sure there's not a whole bunch of like tubs or desks or papers or anything of that nature in that specific location, so that there's no wasted time trying to maneuver around those objects. I think that something that's very important, I work in Tiger Tots on campus, and something that we've learned from the very beginning is that all students need to be watched at all times. So an easy aspect of, not easy, but another aspect of this is making sure that it's very easy to see all students at all times. That way we can check up on their learning and make sure that they're on task doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that learning is effective. Along with that, we need to make sure all of the supplies for the teacher are very handy, as well as the supplies for the student. That way, that goes along with having all of the supplies handy and organized in the classroom. And it's important that you actually run down that with your students, so you get rid of that like time where they spend asking you those questions. And then you also need to make the presentations and displays very visible for students to see. So we're going to touch on a few of these things that I think are important for what differentiated instruction looks like in the classroom. I think it's important that you select a skill to differentiate. It's very simple. So for example, you could do multiplication skills, and you could start with a very specific subject area. So you could do the nines of multiplication. Then you could begin with the easiest class, so a class that you know that is very well put together. They have a good skill, and they're very good at what they do. Then you need to make sure you implement an activity that's very small into a very large unit. So for example, you do it with those nines, and you teach them maybe the 9 method with your fingers, and that can be a differentiated instruction for a kinesthetic learner. It's important to do small group work and to assign homework so that students are ready for anything you may do in the classroom. It's important to provide some help for students who are maybe struggling with, whether that's you as the teacher or the pairs that you have in the classroom. I think it's important that you use that assessment tool to make sure students are effectively learning with their differentiation. We need to repeat that with different types of instruction throughout your units. Between that, you need to pay attention to your students' behaviors and see if they actually like what they're doing. Not to say that like they're always going to like those things, but to some extent you can see whether or not those are actually effective for that differentiation. Next, we'll talk about some examples of not differentiating. So for example, we have a teacher who delivers instruction primarily by lecturing. The reason that this is not okay is because not everyone learns through listening through a lecture. I know that I don't necessarily learn well from a lecture. So students can get easily bored, and you're only teaching to one student type, and that is the auditory type. How to change that is to know the learning styles of your students and have different activities for each style, and then making sure you check up on their mastery skills and having assessments put together to check on how well they're doing. And then you also need to think about the student skills and the pre-assessment. So think about the things that you know about your students already, and that will help you in figuring out how to deliver the information you need to deliver to your students. So next, we'll talk about the groups of students at the beginning of the year who are grouped together based on the previous year's achievement test. The reason this is not okay for differentiation is because a lot can change for a student in a year. You also bump into the learning styles, and then the achievement should be constantly tested, and then mixing students with other students who have a different knowledge level is very helpful. In order to fix that, you need to reassess students regularly. You need to check their learning skills, their mastery skills, and then ask students their actual opinion. Lastly, we'll talk about giving bonus points. I think that this might not be right because it is rewarding a daily expectation. So in order to fix that, you need to have students understand what your expectations are. You need to give verbal praise, not gradebook praise. I think that's a very important part of teaching. Along with that, you need to remind students of how important participation is in your classroom. Lastly, I have my references and the sources.